Uh, Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Debrief. I'm Teddy Chestnut, your host, co-founder of Reichanadter. The Debrief is a series of conversations with founders, executives, and talent thought leaders on how they build talented and diverse teams. I am super thrilled today to be joined by Amy Reichanadter, Chief People Officer over at Databricks. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're going to have a really fun conversation that covers a whole host of stuff. Your career, kind of in people in HR, that's kind of shaped your perspective on the space. How you think about hiring, how you think about the future of HR, AI in the space. There's a lot to kind of cover. But I always love to start with like just a couple kind of warm-up questions, if that works for you.
Great.
Cool.
Perfect.
Um, I guess to start, what's like the last recommendation that you gave? Like on anything, somebody asked you for a recommendation, a book, a restaurant, anything or work related. What's the last recommendation you gave?
Probably the most common question I get right now is more work related, and it's about how to build a data forward culture. And in the context of everything that's going on in the world and the work that Databricks does, I get that question a lot. And I'd say the most common response I give is really to try to simplify it and focus on three things. So one is around leadership support for moving the organization that way. The second one is just to make sure that you have the right level of technology infrastructure. And the third one is to be very clear about what the skill capabilities of your team is, because you can ideally want to move that direction. If you don't have people that have that kind of capability, then it'll make the journey more challenging.
That's like way more thoughtful than like the last one, which was like what's the best like Netflix binge that you've seen?
Oh,
Okay,
but
yeah, cool. What was your first job?
my first job was as a best person in a restaurant in Palo Alto, California. And it was, a great lesson in the importance of education.
Very fair. And like dream job, if you weren't doing what you were doing today, like, and you could, do anything in the world, your existing skills and capabilities notwithstanding, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty blessed to be in the job that I'm in at Databricks, but putting that aside, I have a really weird hobby, which is that I do flying trapeze, like from the circus. And so if I didn't have to do this or didn't have the opportunity to do it, I would definitely be a trapeze artist.
Wait, you still do flying trapeze now?
I do.
That is unbelievable. I thought I was like, I gave up hockey because it was like too hard on the body, but you're clearly putting me to shame here.
Oh, trapeze is definitely hard on the body, but everyone should
Yeah.
try it at least once.
That's wild. Maybe only once, but uh, yeah. Anything great that you're reading or listening to right now?
You know, I'm a huge I'm a huge Adam Grant fan. So right now I've been going back to some of the work life podcast work that he's done, and I think it's great.
Yeah, we're also big Adam Grant fans, so he's a good advisor. Any like particular insight or learning that like or nugget that you pulled from one of the last one or two podcasts?
You know, there's one on toxicity and culture that I think has a lot of really important insights in it, and how to think about the continuum of kind of results focus oriented cultures through more relationship or people focused cultures, and just getting clear on the behaviors that each one is characterized by, and then how to help move through building a culture with that in mind. I think it's been really helpful. So I definitely recommend that particular episode if people haven't seen it.
That's a good one. All right, we'll have to put like a link to that in the
Yeah,
in the
great.
comments when we post
I think
this.
it's called like the seven deadly sins of culture or something.
Ooh, okay. That's like a title coming out swinging. Um,
Exactly.
and last one, but what's your like favorite job interview question and why?
So my kind of go-to interview question right now, because there's been so much change in the world, is really around asking people to provide an example of how they've used customer feedback to fuel innovation. And it's
Hmm.
really an opportunity for two things. One is just to understand whether people have a customer-centric mindset. And
Hmm.
then the other one is that, everything is changing around us, and the world is becoming much more about, how we're able to see possibilities in the future than what we've done in the past. And so I like linking those two things together. And then seeing what people can come up with.
And is there something that you're looking for in that answer in particular, like this is above the bar, this is below the bar, in a
You know,
response?
for me, it's kind of the two elements of it together. One is that can have they had experiences in their past
Mhm,
where they've really taken the time to understand voice of the customer and
mhm,
one, know who their customer is, but two, how did they obtain that feedback and then use it to make change moving forward? And then the second one is really um, around how open people have been to innovation and how they've done things in a creative way, because I do think that that's one of the most important mindsets that any employee can have right now is that everything has the possibility to change at this point. And so the openness to doing that and the level of kind of creative thinking about that, I think, is one of the keys of success for what will make employees successful moving forward. And what used to work, it may not help us anymore. And so you need that kind of openness, I think, to figure out who the right people are to move through this next phase of work.
really interesting. Usually I'll actually leave this question into kind of jump into like our normal, run of show, but I'm actually really curious, especially because you're a chief people officer, so an HR function. So when you say customer, how do you think about customer in that interview question?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's two things. So, depending on the level of the employee in my own function, but one is that, our customers can be many different populations within the company. It can be the executives, it can be leaders across the organization, it could be employees more generally. So, making sure that they have that mindset and can identify exactly who the customer is in each scenario. But the other one is that, we're in a really unique situation where we have the opportunity to kind of lead the field on what it means to use data and AI in the people function.
Mhm.
And so, that means that we have the opportunity to interface with customers more frequently. And a lot of the opportunities that I have often lead with that first question that we talked about like, hey, I'm trying to move my organization to be even open to data and AI and how to use that in our day-to-day work. And that's often the first area where I'm getting pulled in with customers now is that they want to have that conversation and understand like how we've built that at Databricks and how they can use those learnings to help drive change in their own organization.
Very
And it's
cool.
often coming actually from either the CIO or the chief data officer rather than the head of HR when they're
Yeah.
coming to me to have the conversation. But it's quite an interesting way that our role can change right now. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for anyone in the people function to actually be more customer facing in their work.
Very cool. All right, well, we'll come back to these themes later, but I want to go back to like a bit of grounding in your career. I'd love if you could tell me a little bit about just kind of like the career arc that you've had, right? Obviously, CPO at Databricks, which has been an absolute rocket ship, and we'll talk about the transformative experience there. But
Yeah.
before that, Adaptive Insights, and then kind of E2 Open, a couple of these kind of stepping stones along the way. And I'm curious, just like, not maybe every detail, but like the most formative experiences that you had along that journey that kind of led to where you are today.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I feel like I learned a lot from the very beginning of my career, which was that I was like 12 the first time I said I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And so I went all the way through, two masters and a PhD and got to the end of it and realized that I didn't want to do therapy. And that was actually probably the first and most formative aspect of my career was that going through that transition where I'd spent all this time and energy getting to that milestone and then realizing I wasn't in the right place.
Hmm.
And then I sort of fell into HR, to be honest,
Hmm.
mostly because I needed a job and had a lot of student loans to pay off, to be honest. And but I found that I absolutely love the work. And one of the things that really helped me with early on in my career was understanding what it feels like to not be in the right place in your career and how incredible it can feel when you have the opportunity to land in a place that does capitalize on your strengths. So that was probably one of the most formative ones. And then I went through, mostly roles where I was kind of the first person in a medium or small size startup coming in to build the HR function. And I think a lot of what helped me in my career in the most formative moments were almost always where I was asked to do something where I had no idea what I was doing
Yeah.
and being able to lean into that and figure out how to, be comfortable in the grayness of that and drive results through uncertainty are the things that help me, I think, learn the most and ultimately have helped me get more and more opportunities because when people saw that I was somebody that was reliable and going into unclear situation and then helping to bring clarity or drive results, then it just created more opportunities for me to do that at larger scale.
Do you recall, like, was there a moment where you've realized, like, oh, I am in a job that I really feel like I should be in, like the opposite of the kind of clinical psychologist world? Like, was there a light bulb moment where it was like, yes, this is totally it?
Yeah, I think for me, it was actually my first job in tech and HR. And
Mm.
the thing that I found that wasn't a fit for me in terms of doing therapy was that I felt like it was really problem focused, but took a long, long time to get to something that was more solution focused.
Mhm.
And then when I got into tech and I was in HR, I loved the complexity of it. But the thing I love the most is that it was so solution focused. I mean, if you're in a meeting for more than a half an hour and you're not talking about the solution, people think you're wasting their time. And in therapy, you could be, working for 6 months on a problem and people aren't ready to start talking about solution. They still need to kind of sit with working through what happened. And so it just felt like a great fit. And I loved one of the things I really loved about being a generalist was that I got to touch so many different things. And I found that one of my strengths was context switching.
Mm.
And so that I could do that, 50 times a day easily. And that was
Yeah.
something that I really enjoyed. And that's helped me in this role because that's part of, I think, being in the CPO seat is that, I mean, you context switch all day long, and it's something that you have to learn to get good at in this role.
Yeah. It's a great example of a skill that is certainly transferable, right? It's not only unique to a CPO role. It might be a startup executive or anything else that that might be overlooked in terms of the way that you assess for or hire for a role, like test for, or even recognize in yourself. There might be people who like realize that they've been in context switching roles their whole careers, and actually they don't really like it, and but they think they don't like the job. They really don't like that
Right.
element of the
Yeah,
job.
exactly.
Was there something that like helped you understand like hey, context switching is a thing. Oh, I'm really good at it. Oh, I should seek out more situations like that? Or like, was it something you just ultimately kind of reflected on like much, much later?
No, it was actually an experience I had very early on in my career where I had been in a role where I was running HR in a small startup, and I loved recruiting. I
Mm,
just thought it was like such an amazing part of it. And so I figured like, well, I like that the best of all my work, so I should go do that as my career. And then
right.
I went into a role where I was running a recruiting team and realized that I missed all of the different things that I did. And then I realized like, hey, I think I'm actually better at having this be a part of what I do rather than all of what I do. And maybe what I'm good at is doing,
Yeah.
10 different things rather than one thing really well.
Fascinating. So the kind of career trajectory, right, from recruiter, and then I should go do this, but wait, I want that to be part of my role. Like, what's the shape of your career trajectory looked like over time? Like, if you drew a line, right, x-axis is time and y-axis is, I don't know, however you define
Yeah.
advancement or success or, fit, like, what's the line look like?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a progression of more and more responsibility over time,
Hmm.
but I often share with people like it wasn't done intentionally. Actually, I was probably the opposite of that. And every time I've ever asked someone the question of like, where do you want to be in 3 years? I always feel like it's not fair because I never had any idea. I mean, I never set out in my work to be like, oh, I'd like to be a chief people officer. But the things that I did focus on were some of what we talked about before. It was always about kind of filling in the white space around me in an organization and figuring out what needed to be done and how I could help that. And then the second thing was I always tried to focus on making the people around me successful. And
Hmm.
because of those two things, I got more and more opportunities, but it wasn't like I went through my career like, oh, I'm going to do this and then now I need to go to a bigger company. And I was never that purposeful about
Yeah.
it. And I'm not sure that's right or wrong the way I approached it, but it was the way that I looked at it in my career, and it did help me. And ultimately, it led to me getting more and more opportunity, but not because I had a big master plan around
Yeah. So that, first person, early stage startup, first person doing the job, but doing that at Databricks, I feel like is probably a completely different experience. So I'd love to hear like what that has been what that's looked like versus what it looked like in prior roles.
it. Sure. I mean, I often tell people I've learned more in the last plus years at Databricks than I have in the last 20 combined. But when I first came into Databricks, it actually didn't look that different than other opportunities that I'd had, in that we were about 500 people. So it was kind of a mid-sized startup. And the people function was behind where the company was. And so there were a few people that sat in finance and a couple of recruiters that sat in the business, but the sort of philosophy and strategy around people hadn't really been developed yet. And all of the infrastructure and functions that you would normally have in the HR realm didn't really exist. And so in my mind, it was similar to what I'd done before. And it probably speaks to my own flavor of crazy, because I was like, well, this will be fun. We'll just do it in an environment where we're growing more than 100%. And and then now, we've grown to over 6,500 employees. So we've hired 6,000 people in the last few years through COVID and everything else that's happened with changes in the world. So it's been an extraordinary opportunity, and most importantly, an amazing learning experience.
When you're growing at that pace, hiring that many people and building the entire people function from the ground up, you can't possibly get to the right level of maturity on everything all at once.
No.
So, what did you start with? What were like the foundations that were like, I have to get this right first, and these other things can kind of trail along while we go, and we'll catch up afterward.
I mean, it was probably one of the mistakes I made, was that I felt like we needed to build everything at once because of the deficit in so many areas. But
Mm,
in reality, it's impossible to do that. So we ended up prioritizing two things first, and then I'll talk about what that led to. The the hiring demands were so significant. So that was really priority one, was figuring out how we did hiring excellence at scale.
mm,
But the second one was compensation too, because we didn't have a compensation philosophy and we didn't have the right sort of infrastructure in place to be able to support the hiring that we needed. And so those were two things that had to be done in partnership with one another. And then the third one, which I ended up coming to later, but realizing how important it was actually around leadership development.
mm,
Because growing at this scale, and particularly in the context of COVID
mm,
and moving everybody home, that we had to have the leaders enabled to understand how to hire here, what was important in the culture. And they were such a key part of our growth trajectory, and getting super clear about what our expectations were for them, helping them understand that, and then helping them understand how we wanted to do things at Databricks that was different than what they'd done in their prior opportunities, was a really important part of our success. And, one, getting the hiring done at the right level of
yeah,
quality, but also building a company where people feel like they are having great experience every day.
yeah. So hit the hiring plan, figure out how to pay people, and then let's make sure we grow and retain people with the right leadership, kind of
Exactly.
as we grow. On the hiring piece, I mean, I think every talent team I've ever talked to feels like they're trying to balance kind of speed and quality, or efficiency and quality, kind of do more with less, don't lower the bar. But must be like wildly exacerbated when you're trying to grow 100% year over year, hire 6,000 people in just a few years. How did you think about that trade-off of speed and quality? And how did you not have them end up being, two desires that like ran at odds to one another?
Yeah, I think it was one of the areas that actually we had the most clarity around, which is
Mm,
that we were absolutely uncompromising on quality. And so if that meant that you had to take longer, then there was sort of implicit permission to do that,
mm,
because the way that we measure the quality of our leaders is on their ability to hire. And
mm,
so we do have to meet the hiring plan, but if you can't hire well, you won't have a long, successful career here. And so we spent a lot of time, our first sort of level of investment in training leaders was around this piece,
mm,
and understanding our hiring principles, and then exactly how to execute that and operationalize it in the hiring process. And if that meant it took longer, there was sort of permission that that was okay.
mm,
But I think if you try to balance both, you'll end up compromising on quality, is really where you'll end up. And I remember probably a month into my employment at Databricks, sitting down with Ali Ghodsi, our CEO, and asking him what his biggest concern was around people. And
mm,
his answer was so clear to me, which was that he was afraid that the quality of our talent would degrade as we
mm.
scaled. And so I was like, okay, I got it. Then we know exactly what we need to do to help managers understand that quality is a non-negotiable and speed is something we're willing to be flexible on.
Speed is easier to measure than quality, which is maybe why if you try to do both, you end up compromising on quality because it's very easy to see that we're a day late or a week late. How did you think about defining that quality bar in a way that everybody could understand, see, recognize, employ, check against, you know?
Yeah.
And did that change over time, right? And from the very early days to when you're now 6,000 people, has the definition of that bar changed in any way?
It actually hasn't changed, believe it or not. And the biggest challenge we had early on was actually just codifying it for people because it was very clear in the minds of the founders and the early employees at Databricks what great looked like
Hmm.
and where the quality bar was. And so I felt like my role was actually as a translator of that, which was to take that to figure out how we put it into a set of hiring principles that any manager could understand and then training them on it. And then we have to operationalize that and how do you structure the interview so that we make sure that we're actually effectively measuring that? Do we have a rubric for hiring? That all the things that go into operationalizing it at scale. But the first and most important part for me was actually the translation and understanding what great looked like in the minds of the CEO and e-staff and then helping managers understand where the bar was here and then being able to make sure that we could hold that at that level, even as we were growing at the pace we have been.
What was the biggest challenge if the bar hasn't changed at all and kind of the translation hasn't changed as you've grown, what's been the biggest challenge in terms of hiring uh over that period?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about what the biggest challenge has been, then I can talk about what's gotten easier over time,
Yeah.
actually. Um, The biggest challenge was two things early on. One is that we had a super high bar, but when I started, we were 500 people and people didn't really know who Databricks was. And of course, we only wanted to hire like the best and the brightest from all these large companies. And, it was a big challenge to get them attracted to Databricks, which
Hmm.
is why the compensation piece also needed to be addressed in parallel. But the other piece was actually because we were hiring so many people and often people coming in from the same organizations, is that they had their own bar.
Mm.
And so they all came in with shared context from Amazon or Google or
Hmm.
Meta. And so we had to help them understand what was important here, how we hire. And it was an area where there was a lot of friction at first. And part of it for me was going back to that point of translating, like helping them understand what it meant to raise the bar at Databricks versus
Hmm.
their prior organizations, and then how we could get them comfortable in executing that, and then ultimately doing that with their teams.
Yeah.
The thing that's gotten easier over time has been just the fact that as we've scaled, that we're able to compete more effectively with
Oh,
larger
sure.
companies, and so that just the brand awareness and the success of the company has helped a lot of these things that felt a lot harder, to be honest, when we were 500 or 1,000 employees.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. I know like one of the core values of Databricks is raise the bar, and you've also talked about like a philosophy of like every hire trying to make the company better.
Yeah.
And you just brought up something interesting, which is, you know, if I come from one company to a different company, the culture might be different, the bar might be different, the way that you are successful might be different. So it's not just the individual, it's also the team that you're stepping into that really influences like what success looks like. How has that influenced the way that you think about hiring, structuring interviews, training your hiring managers on like what to look for? That element of like we have a unique way of doing things here at Databricks, and so yeah, I'm curious like how that influences how you think about like what the bar looks like.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the two pieces for us around the bar have been one is just helping managers really understand, deeply understand the organization that they're trying to build, the current strengths and capabilities of their team, because that philosophy that every person has an opportunity to make the team better, there's an implicit understanding that you have to actually know who your team is,
Mm,
deeply know them. And
yeah.
so we've spent a lot of time not just training people how to hire, but really investing in leadership development. And we have a program we've developed called Leadership. And
Mm,
basically, the program is taught by our founders and e-staff. It's coordinated by my team, but it's really based on the principles of leaders teaching leaders.
mm,
And a lot of that is actually helping them understand every aspect of what's different at Databricks. And so we have a set of leadership principles Um, and part of that program is around sort of walking leaders through the whole employee life cycle and what the expectations are at Databricks specifically. But it's that program's been really well received, and it's been an important part of our scaling efforts. And there have been some other side benefits, which is things like executive interaction and other things that leaders don't get as much when we're in this kind of hybrid world that we're in
Right.
now, has been another side benefit of choosing to educate our leaders in that particular way.
Hmm. I'm really curious. We all make hiring mistakes, right? They happen, they're inevitable. And I'm curious if, in your view, it's more often that we make a mistake because we misinterpreted the evaluation, we missed something at the individual level, like this person wasn't who we expected them to be, or because we didn't understand the team well, and so we put somebody onto this team where actually they weren't set up for success or they weren't going to thrive. Or if you think there's a different kind of underpinning for like where hiring mistakes
Yeah.
typically come from.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it actually can come in both flavors. What I see the most often at Databricks has been more of the reality where they don't really understand Databricks and they're just trying to come in from their prior context and
Mhm,
bring the person that they liked the most or worked the most closely with. And they assume like if they got hired, then that person also will be a great fit. And it
mhm,
ignores the concept that we were talking about we have a set of clear hiring principles and you have to understand the whole fit of the team. And so that
mhm.
person may have been fantastic in a prior context, but doesn't really fit here
That
for
makes
one of those reasons. It either doesn't complement the team or it doesn't meet our hiring bar. And I think there's the other side of it where there is a little bit of the sort of magic that goes into it. Like I know I had made a mistake on my team historically where I like very strictly was hiring to the hiring principles, but the chemistry wasn't right.
mm,
And so then that's another area where like, yeah, it that all has to fit together.
mhm.
And so you have to be able to assess, I think, both sides of it, which is do they meet the expectations of the organization and is the chemistry right on a personal level where you're gonna love working with that person every
Yeah.
day.
How do you infuse the idea of inclusion into all of what we've talked about in terms of hiring? You're setting a certain bar, who's going to fit in the culture, right? Some of those could be misinterpreted, misconstrued, or misapplied in a way that actually makes the hiring process less inclusive than more. And so I'm very curious how you think about ensuring that you uphold that principle while the others as well.
Yeah, it's been an interesting part of it. Like, I feel really fortunate that we've had the opportunity to build our culture of inclusion sort of from the ground up as we were scaling, and both in terms of our DEI program, but also how we wanted to operationalize that in things like our hiring practices. And
Mm,
one of our hiring principles is what we call experience great. And that could seem very narrow in some people's mind, like, oh, that means I have to have gone to, Berkeley in our case, or worked at Google, but we've really spent a lot of time educating leaders around the fact that experience great could mean lots of different things. It could be that somebody was the first person in their family to go to college.
mm,
Or it could be that they did something extraordinary in their own field. Maybe it wasn't at a level where they were, going to a top institution, but
right.
they, had the opportunity to really move the needle on something. The thing that's important about it, and then that we train our managers on, is that it has to be deeper than the resume or the LinkedIn profile,
Mm,
because that piece of it you're not going to get just from looking at somebody's background online. And
right.
so you have to be willing to spend the time with candidates to really understand how to interview well and to get underneath all of that to understand whether or not back to those two principles of like how do they complement your team and what are they capable of to move the needle.
Mhm,
That's something where you just have to spend time with people to really understand that more deeply.
yeah. So I imagine as Databricks was growing like gangbusters, a very large share of your mind share was on hiring. Even though your CPO used to have you have a whole recruiting team, but still like that's the number one priority. Today, how much of your mind share is focused on hiring versus other really important responsibilities come across your purview?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'd say probably 50% of it is still on hiring
Still,
because
wow.
we're still hiring really aggressively. And so that's still an important part of it. And
Mhm,
as we've grown at this pace, the needs are continuing to evolve.
Hmm.
And so we want to make sure that we're really meeting the needs of the business. And it's things like the talent level and engineering and the skill sets that we're looking for, they've
Hmm.
continued to change. And so you can't really let your foot off the gas on that. And
Yeah.
so that's been a core focus area. But I think the other thing that's really continued to change for me is really the opportunity that we have to be out in front of the transformation that's going on
Mm.
around AI and data and what that looks like in the people function. And so that's been sort of a new and evolving area that I feel really excited about and
Yeah.
very fortunate to have the opportunity to be a part of.
I'm going to transition to that topic in one sec, but I'm really curious, actually, the time horizons that you think about when you're thinking about hiring. So if I'm a recruiter, I'm thinking about, you know, the hire I'm trying to make this week. From the head of recruiting, it might be this quarter. Like, what time horizon are you thinking about? Is it quarterly? Is it annually? Is it 3 years from now? When you think about your work as a CPO as it relates to hiring?
It's very much, to be honest, on a year by year basis. And of course, my team is, fantastic about driving the operations to make sure monthly, quarterly, we're meeting the numbers. But for me, it's hard to project out more than a year at
Mhm.
this pace of growth. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of the things that I've learned working in the context of this kind of hyper growth on such an extended basis is that really the company's so different every couple of quarters that it's very hard to plan years ahead. And,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure it's a really good use of time, to be honest, because there's so many things that are evolving and changing in the moment. And so, just looking at this 1 year at a time has been kind of feels like the right level
Yeah.
of, I'm up on the balcony looking out at what's ahead of me and then still focusing on the changing needs around me today.
Yeah. Um, oh, so let's shift a little bit. You mentioned a number of times kind of being on the forefront of like data analytics, and bringing that to the business. And you've also just mentioned about how like much the business changes, right? Like quarter to quarter, year to year. So I'm really curious, as a chief people officer, what data and insights are like on your core dashboard, and have any of those metrics, not themselves, but like, how often have you changed what metrics are on that dashboard because the business is changing?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, we're very data driven, so we have, a lot of metrics that we look at as a regular practice, very deep in the hiring metrics, very focused on attrition. And
Mhm.
I'd say probably the one metric that we've had to develop that has helped me understand where our leaders are is that, we first went through the process of developing our core leadership principles, which are kind of the expectations for what great leadership looks like at Databricks.
Mhm.
And then we had to find a way to measure it.
Mm.
And so that we could understand and give feedback to leaders as a regular practice about how they were doing. Because it's one thing to educate them on it, and it's another thing to understand, how it's being, brought to life in their day-to-day work life. So we basically developed an index called the Brickster Leadership Index, which is basically a measurement of how they're doing against the leadership essentials.
Mm.
And that's one of the things now that I look at as a regular practice because we want to understand sort of the trending data on that and how leaders are doing against the, sort of where we have the bar on that and either helping them work through action planning if they're not in the right place or focus on the leaders that are really doing well. And then how do we use them to help propel the organization forward. So that's kind of a
Mm.
unique Databricks metric and how we've thought end to end about what our expectations are, the investments we're making in development, and then how we give that feedback to leaders, and then how we help them when they're not in the right place to make sure that they're getting the support that they need to either be successful or, and also on the retention front for our best leaders, making sure we've identified them and that we're really investing in them and making sure that we have a great career path for them moving forward.
At the risk of asking you to share IP, yeah, my head goes to like employee engagement, right? It's very common for leaders to be measured in terms of the engagement of their team. Is that part of this kind of Brickster leadership kind
It's
of
not really.
index?
No.
But and is there anything beyond engagement, right? In terms of I don't know, strategic planning or delivery or results, like how comprehensive is this kind of view of what it takes or what it looks like to be a good leader at
Yeah.
Databricks?
I mean, we do measure engagement and they get that data too, but it's actually not part of this particular index that I'm
Hmm.
talking about. And our leadership principles move from everything from the ability to set vision and strategy, execution. Part of it is building a great team.
Yeah.
And there's another element around how they drive culture within their team. So that could be related to engagement, but that's not the language that we use around it. And basically, we developed a set of questions that directly measure those principles.
Hmm.
And then that's the feedback that we want to give to leaders as a regular practice so that they know where they are in terms of how well they've operationalized the principles at work.
Fascinating. Have you seen stress in those principles at all through, 2021 looked very different than 2023 in terms of like macro economy, right? Pre-COVID and then COVID, then hybrid look very different in terms of team building. Like, how much stress has that kind of set of principles undergone, or have they held up really strongly in kind of all these different environments?
I mean, I think they're sort of timeless, to be honest. So, regardless of what's happening in the world around us, I don't see those principles changing because they're very true to who we are.
Mhm.
Um, so, we have a set of leadership principles, but we also have a set of culture principles that applies broadly across the company. And that is an area where we have revisited, and we did
Mhm.
it kind of coming out of COVID. And it felt like the right time for us, given, all the changes in what was going on in the way people work, along with how much we had grown,
Yep.
to sit down with the founders. And so I had an incredible opportunity to work with our founders to kind of recast how we wanted to think about them. And we did it in kind of a unusual way. So I'll share really briefly what we did,
Yeah.
which is that we went through a pretty rigorous study of the behavior of our employees. And we looked at employees who had done really well in the company and those that had struggled. And then we also looked at times when we had done our most important work for customers or innovation in the product. And through that analysis, that's how we came up with our culture principles. And I often tell people, like, you could remove the word culture principles and just replace it with the title of like the behaviors of employees who do really well at Databricks. That's what it is. It's just a roadmap for them.
Yeah.
And those are the things that are important. And so I do think that making sure that you do periodically revisit, and the world around us has changed, as we all know, so significantly in the last couple of years that I do think it's incumbent on leaders across the board, but particularly in the chief people officer role, to make sure that they are going through that discussion with their leaders around them.
What advice would you give to a chief people officer who feels like, she or he needs to clarify what behaviors lead to successful outcomes, but doesn't have their hands around the methodology or the tools or the approach or the data inputs to really do that? Like, where would you start?
Yeah. The first conversation I would have would be with the CEO and just ask him or her what's important to them, and make sure that you have that feedback first, because that was the thing that I found that was so interesting, was that I had that conversation, and our CEO, he had such a clear view
Hmm.
of what was important to him in this case. And so that was a great starting point. And then we started working from there to help look at the behaviors across the board, and to do a deeper analysis. But it was interesting that just having that initial conversation, that there was so much clarity there. And I don't think before that we'd ever had the conversation in that way.
Hmm.
And sometimes I'll pull out a slide. I've showed it to our leaders of like where this conversation started. And when Ali wrote down what was important, I mean, he has a slide entitled "What Makes a Brickster Great," and we call our employees Bricksters. So
Yeah.
it was very clear. And so I think if you don't have either the background or the data available, I think you can start with that leadership conversation, and get pretty far, to be honest.
There's an implicit kind of assumption or kind of jump in that, which is if the CEO has clarity on what makes for successful employee behaviors, that is cascaded somehow through the organization. And I wonder if like if you believe that there are like deliberate or specific things that a CEO does that ensures that cascades, or if actually like we may underestimate how likely it is that those things cascade just implicitly, like how far they actually get. If the CEO's clarity, it just kind of happens.
Well, it's funny because one of the things that we did after we developed the current version of our culture principles was we actually went through the exercise of making sure that we had clarified exactly what mechanisms we were going to use to bring those principles to life.
Hmm.
And so I do think that, going back to the Adam Grant podcasts is that when there is that disconnect between what people say is important and then what the behaviors is, that's actually where people end up defining it often as a toxic culture.
Mhm.
And so you have to be really careful about the alignment between what's being said and how people show up. And one of the things that I liked about this approach was that it was all based on behaviors. And there were a few things in there that were aspirational, but they were actually based on the data of how people had done well. So people could look around and there was a consistency alignment between what we were saying was important and what they had seen reinforced. But I think that principle of like making sure you know what mechanisms are going to continue to reinforce it, for us, it was particularly important because we were scaling at a pace that most people don't.
Right,
And, we were mostly at home still. So we're trying to,
right.
help people understand what's important while they're working from their, bedroom or basement or whatever,
Mhm.
wherever they were at home.
Um, well, let's shift gears a little bit. You mentioned kind of AI and kind of data have the opportunity to really kind of revolutionize what the people function can do. What are you most excited about? I mean, generative AI is now, 14, 15 months old.
Yeah.
GPT-5 is about to come out, and the expectations of what it's going to be able to do are kind of, seemingly limitless. Like what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is really around the level of experimentation we can do right now because it's a new area for everyone. So we're all trying to figure it out. And, I always laugh when people are like, "Oh, we're experts in this." I was like, "Is anyone really an expert?" It's so new. We're just trying to, we're all learning together. And my hope, to be honest, is that it's very much in a way like COVID was, is that that was an opportunity, particularly for people in the people space where we none of us had a playbook for what it was going to look like, and we all came together probably more closely than we ever had before to figure out how to work through it. And I would love for this to be the next version of that.
Oh,
Because I think most of us right now are all focused on sort of driving efficiency through AI, whether it's a chatbot or, those are the things that are sort of obvious that people are working on. But we're all going to learn through this together. And I hope opportunity for all of us to come together like we did before and share ideas and we'll learn a lot from one another. So that's my real hope for how we move through this space together.
is there a you mentioned like driving efficiency is like obviously the kind of the starting point or the easiest place to
Yeah.
imagine applying technology like this first. Is there a part of the people suite, whether it's hiring or leadership development or succession planning or comp or benefits or engagement, whatever, where you think like I would love to see it there first. Like this is the area where I'm most excited about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot we can do in sourcing actually that will
Hmm.
help us. And it does require that you have a clear bar for what you're hiring for. But I think that's an area where I think most people are moving into the sort of chatbot space first, because that's a really clear one. The technology is quite good already. But I think that, on the hiring side, I think there's a lot we can do on the sourcing side in terms of using AI and driving efficiency there that will really help speed up what we're doing. And it's not intended to be a replacement for people. It's just an augmentation to
Yeah.
help them be more effective, to do their jobs more quickly and more thoroughly. And there'll always be some judgment in the hiring process, but I think there's some really amazing things we can do in that space that I'm excited about.
I'm curious your take on a controversial question, which I don't think has been quite resolved yet, which is like the use of AI by candidates tailor my resume to the job description, help me prep for the interview. Like I get very polarizing reactions to like that's cheating or that's just like using a calculator. Like what's your take on like candidates' use of AI to prep, to present themselves, to search for jobs? Yeah, I'm curious how you think that might change actually like the overall landscape in terms of like the employer candidate dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't have a problem with it. To me, it's more an indication that that person will lean into, the technology available to them, that they're thinking more innovatively about it. And then I think it's also incumbent to make sure that you have a very structured interview process
Mhm.
and that you know exactly what you're looking for and that you know how to interview well and interview deeply. And then I think that's where reference checking is going to become an even more important part of our process,
Hmm.
both doing it front door references and also backdoor references, just to make sure that the authenticity is there, because I think that's what people are worried about, is that, somebody might prep really well using AI to help them, But at
Right.
the end of the day, you want to make sure that the skill sets that you're bringing into the organization match what you saw on the resume or in the interview. And so that's the thing you have to test for and figure out how you're going to kind of take a 360-degree view to get to the heart of that. But if people embrace new technology to do a better job, like I'm fully supportive.
Um, you mentioned that like your excitement around experimentation. Sometimes people get pushback in terms of experimentation from their legal teams, from their compliance teams, right? They want to put guardrails around what you can or can't do with, large language models. How are you thinking about creating the conditions for experimentation? Are there guardrails you're putting in place or principles you're putting in place for experimentation with AI in the context of the people space?
It's interesting. We've tried to, I mean, you have to be very sensitive about the data in the people space because there's a lot of confidential
Mhm.
information. And so we've actually worked really closely in partnership with our IT team to think about how we wanted to experiment. And the way we started when this all started to emerge was that we did kind of a hackathon. And so we vetted ideas together and then let teams come forward with sort of, prototypes of what that could look like. And that gave us the opportunity, one, to get people really involved and excited about the changes that were coming, but secondly, also for us to have the space to think about what we were doing and not just send people off like, hey, this is new. Like, everyone, please go in 50 different directions and try it out. And so we could get sort of organized about it. And, one of the things that I see a lot is that, the more involved you can get people into the change, then the more they
Mhm.
feel excited about it and like they're contributing to it. And so that's been a way that we within Databricks approached it initially. And we've continued to invest in those areas because we have sort of a list of, projects that even though we had to bet on a couple of items to start with, but we have like a backlog of great ideas. And so we've taken it uh, sort of step by step in a systematic way to make sure we had some control over what was happening, but also could make people really excited about being part of this transformation.
Very cool. I'm going to come all the way back to your favorite interview question. Like, what customer feedback, however you think about your customers, what customer feedback are you hearing that you're most excited to tackle now with AI innovation, new technology kind of at your fingertips?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think the thing that I feel the most excited about is that culture is probably my biggest passion in terms of how you build it and how it evolves over time, whether it's through scale or difficult times. And I think the thing that I am hearing the most from customers, both within Databricks and also our external customers, is this transformation around like the technology is changing, but then how do you transform cultures to be more data forward? And that's an element that I am super passionate about, and it's the thing that I'm hearing the most and probably have the most excitement about how we help um, organizations become different in order to embrace the technology opportunities that we have in front of us right now.
Amy Reichanadter, Chief People Officer of Databricks. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was a super fun conversation. Career
Thank you.
path, hiring, AI, leadership development, covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you spending the time.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me. It was really awesome to spend the time with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy.